Hi guys, it's me Ari from Ari's Guitar Lessons. Now if I were to ask you to play me, let's say an F major, I'm very sure that most of you will be able to do that easily. However, if the chord that you need to play is, let's say, a G major 7 sharp 5 sharp 9, then I'm pretty sure that a lot of you will be having difficulties. And that's not because the chord happens to be a very difficult one, but it's because most of us don't really understand how chord names work, how chords are constructed. And that's precisely the intent of this video. In fact, this video is actually going to be a part of an ongoing series on music theory, and the core will be understanding chords, understanding chord construction, right? So we'll be starting off with some really basic chords like major, minors, diminished, augmented, and then we'll move on to some really difficult chords as well. But I do understand that a lot of you won't really understand music theory, which is why I'll start off with the very basics. So we'll be talking a couple of concepts of music theory which are pretty beginner level, and then we'll eventually move on to some really nice and interesting stuff. Alright, so there are two concepts that I would want you guys to be absolutely comfortable with. The first concept is that of notes. Yep. And the second concept is intervals. So let me write it here. Okay, so we'll start off with the first concept, which is notes or basic note theory. If I were to ask you, how many notes are there in music? What do you think is the answer? Most of the people are of the assumption that there are 7 notes, which is actually incorrect. The total number of notes in music happen to be 12. Yeah, and these 12 notes, 7 notes out of these happen to be called natural notes. Yeah, and there are another 5. We'll come to these 5 later. But these natural notes are basically C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. Right? C, D, E, F, G, A, B. These are 7 notes which are the natural notes. If you've seen a keyboard or a piano, you must have noticed that there are white keys and there are black keys. The white keys happen to be the natural notes, so these 7. And then afterwards, after B, it's the same cycle. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So it's like a circle. Yeah, it keeps getting repeated after that. So these 7 happen to be the natural notes. But in addition to these 7, there happen to be 5 notes which are called accidentals. Yeah. Now these accidentals have names as well, and I'll come to that. But let's look at these 7 natural notes. Between the C and a D, there happens to be one accidental. Between a D and E, there is an accidental. E and F do not have any accidental between them. F and G have an accidental. G and A have an accidental, and A and B have an accidental. And of course, after B comes C, and there is no accidental between a B and a C, right? So all the natural notes have an accidental between them except EF and BC. So these are 2 pairs which do not have an accidental. Now just like these natural notes, these accidentals have names as well. Now accidentals can be of 2 types. The first is a sharp, the second is a flat. Sharp is represented by a hashtag, this hashtag sign, and a flat is represented with a small b. Okay, sharp essentially means when you raise by 1 note, and flat means to lower by 1 note. So essentially, if you take any note and you raise it, so if you're playing a guitar, let's say you're playing the 3rd fret of the top string of a guitar, which happens to be a G. Now if you move towards the sound box, so this is a guitar, this is a sound box. Raising essentially means moving towards the sound box. Lowering means moving towards the head. So this is the guitar, this is the head, and this is the sound box. So raising means coming in this direction, lowering means going in that direction. So a sharp would be to the right, flat would be to the left. Yeah. So if you, again in guitar terminology, if you're raising by 1 note means you're moving 1 fret to the right, and flat means lowering by 1 note, or moving one fret to the left, right? So so that's what sharp means. Sharp is one note to the right, flat is one note to the left. Now if you were to look at these notes, between a C and a D, I told you that there's an accidental. Now this note, the accidental, is one note to the right of C. So therefore this one is called a C sharp. So this accidental is one note to the right of C, or it's a C sharp, or C raised by one note. Now your question will be that this note also happens to be one note to the left of D, and you're absolutely right. So therefore this note actually has two names. It can be called a C sharp, or one note to the right of C, or it can also be called a D flat, or one note to the left of D. Yeah? Now there'll be a question in your mind, I'll come to that question later. Similarly, this accidental between a D and an E can be called both a D sharp or an E flat. Yeah? E and F, no accidental. F and G, there's an accidental. It's an F sharp, or it can be a G flat. G and A, there's an accidental, a G sharp or an A flat. A and B, there's an accidental, A sharp or a B flat. And similarly, B and C, they don't have any accidental between them. Yeah, so the question that you must have thought is, if there is this one particular note between, let's say, a C and a D, it can be called a C sharp, and it can be called a D flat as well. So why do we have these two types of accidentals? Because essentially both the sharp and a flat are representing the same note. So why do we have the need to call them by two separate names? Now this is actually a question which is it's a very valid question, but I don't really want to talk I don't really want to get into those details here, but I'll tell you a couple of things actually. So these such notes which actually have two different names, or in music theory it's called different spellings, are called enharmonic equivalent. So essentially any note which has two different spellings, or anything which has two different names, is called an enharmonic equivalent. In the case of accidentals, both the sharp and flat can actually represent the same note, but there is a need to have different names, because if you get into music theory, if you get really deep into music theory, you will realize that having a sharp and a flat actually makes things a lot easier. Yeah, again, it's a very valid question. Why do we have these two? But it's not really needed for this particular lesson, which is why I'm going to skip it. However, if you understand Hindi, then I actually have a course on music theory called Practical Music Theory, and in that course I've actually explained all those details. So if you want to purchase that course, it's going to be there, the link is going to be there in the description box. However, it's not really that essential for you to understand, but just know that a lot of people actually have this misconception that it's the same thing, and you can actually use whichever notation you want. So you can actually use a sharp, or you can call it a flat. That's not true. We are actually a lot more comfortable with using sharps. Generally, people are a lot more comfortable with using sharps as compared to flats. But believe me, if you really understand music theory, and if you get into the depths of music theory, you will realize that we do need two different kinds of accidentals, and it makes things a lot easier. Okay, but right now, just to keep things simple, I just don't want to get into those details. So yeah, so there are 5 accidentals. There's one accidental between a C and a D. There's an accidental between a D and an E. E, F, no accidental. F and G accidental. G, A accidental. A, B accidental. B, C, no accidental. So essentially we've got 12 notes, and yeah, so I hope that is understood. So with that, we've cleared level 1, which happens to be note theory. Now we move on to the next part of this video, which is understanding intervals. So let me just write down those 12 notes again. So there's a C, and now because I have limited space, I'll be using just one accidental. So I won't be saying C, C sharp / D flat. I'll just say C and C sharp. Okay, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and a C. Alright, so this is all the 12 notes in sequence. Yeah? Now we move on to the second part, which is about intervals. Now what exactly is an interval? Interval is basically the building block of music, and essentially interval means the distance between any two notes. Now, why did we have the need to have a name for a distance? That's because if let's say I'm a guitarist and I'm talking to another guitar player, I'll say something like, the conversation is going to be something like this. So just play me the 5th fret of the top string, which happens to be an A. So play me an A. That note is not right. So why don't you just play me? Why don't you just move 2 frets ahead, or maybe go 1 string down and 2 frets to the right, something like that. That's essentially how one guitar player is going to be talking to another guitar player. If I am a piano player or keyboard player, I'll say something like, okay, play me a C. That note is not right. Why don't you just play me the key right after that? Something like that. So this is how a discussion is going to be, depending on the instrument that I play, or depending on the instrument that the person that I'm talking to plays, right? But it's not standard. So having the concept of musical intervals actually makes things very simple, and it makes it very standardized. In fact, music theory is standard, so regardless of the instrument that you play, music theory stays the same, and that's the beauty of music theory. So that's also one of the reasons why we have this thing called musical intervals, which, like I told you, is nothing but the gap, the distance between any two notes, right? So I'll just explain all of that in detail. So there are 12 notes, so there are a lot of intervals that we need to understand. So in order to understand intervals, what I want you to do is, let's just start off with a major scale. Now, in case you don't really know what a major scale is a heptatonic scale, or basically it's a 7-note scale, and so it's got 7 notes, and those notes are actually, so let's take a C major. So a C major scale is actually the simplest major scale because it has no accidentals, so there's no sharps or flats in a C major scale. So all natural notes, so basically C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. So all natural notes, these also happen to be a C major scale. Okay, now if we were to look at the gaps between these notes, between a C and a D, there's 2 notes. Now, one thing I just wanted to add before this, there is this thing called, I'm pretty sure you must have heard of it, there is this thing called a half step and a whole step. So when you move, so any 2 consecutive notes actually have a half step gap between them. So a C to a C sharp is a half step. A C sharp to a D is a half step. D to a D sharp is a half step, right? So 1 fret to the fret right after that is a half step. Similarly, 2 half steps make a whole step. So from a C to a C sharp is a half step, C sharp to a D is another half step, but from a C to a D is a whole step. Yeah, so this is half steps and whole steps. These can also be represented with a tone or a semitone. So a whole step is actually called a tone. So 1 whole step is equal to 1 tone, and a half step is a semitone. So yeah, so half step is the same as a semitone, whole step is the same as a tone. Okay, so if you were to look at a major scale has a formula: whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, which essentially means that between the first and the second note of that major scale there is a whole step gap. Between the second and the third, which is a D and E, there is a whole step. Between an E and F, there is a half step, so they're together. F and G, there's a whole step. G and A, there's a whole step. A and B, there's a whole step. And B and C, again, no accidental between them, so that's a half step. So a major scale is represented by this formula: whole step, half step, whole step, half step. That being said, something which I always tell all of my students is never be dependent on this formula. You should be knowing at least the major scales by heart. So major scales for natural notes, major scales for all the accidentals as well, you should know it by heart. So C major, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. D major, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. E major, E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, E. F major, F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F. G major, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. A major, A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. B major, B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B. So again, the intent is not to show off. I've been playing for like 20 years now, so this is no big deal, believe me. The intent is not to show off. The intent is that you should be knowing all your major scales exactly the way I just recited them. Yeah, so major scales for natural notes, major scales for the accidentals as well. Because music theory, everything starts off with the major scale. Everything in music theory starts off with the major scale as the point of reference. So remember that. Remember all your major scales. As simple as that. However, for this lesson, you don't really need to remember the major scale. It's just that I would want you to remember that, just remember that. But for today's lesson, you don't really need to remember all this. But anyways, so C major scale is nothing, it can be represented with this formula, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step, which essentially are gaps, right? But how do we talk these gaps in music interval lingo? So so these gaps are between two consecutive notes. Now in music interval, we'll talk basis the root note. So this is a C major scale. So the root note happens to be a C. So all the gaps from a C is what we'll try to understand. From a C to a D, which is essentially a whole step, that is called a major second. It can also be represented with a capital M followed by a 2. So a major second. So one whole step is actually called a major second. From a C to an E, okay, so we just talking these notes first. We'll talk about these accidentals later. Right now, I just want to keep these things very simple for you. So just understand intervals with this in the way that I want you guys to understand. Okay, so from a C to a D, from first note of the major scale to the second note of a major scale, the interval is a major second. From the first note of a major scale to the third note of a major scale, the interval is called a major third, right? A capital M and a 3. From the first, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1. So 1 to 2 is a major second in the case of a major scale. 1 to 3 is a major third. 1 to 4, C to F, is called a perfect fourth. Now there is a reason why it's called a perfect fourth and not a major fourth. Again, but it's not really important for this particular lesson. I'll probably make a lesson some other time. 1 to 4 is a perfect fourth. 1 to 5th, C to a G, is a perfect fifth. Perfect fourth, fifth, perfect fifth. C to an A, or the 6th note, is a major 6th. C to a B, or the 7th note, is a major 7th. And C to the next C is called an octave. Octave. Okay? C to the same, if you play the same note twice, it's called a unison. Not really important, but I'm just letting you know. So C to a C is a unison, C to a D is a major second, C to an E is a major third, and so on. So major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and octave. Once again, remember that all of these gaps are from the root note, right? The individual gaps between these notes happen to be a whole step, half step, or you can also say a whole step is like a major second. So you can say a C to D is a major second, D to E is major second, E to F is something we haven't really gotten into that interval. F to G is again a whole step, so major second, right? So all of these intervals are from the C or the tonic note. Now these happen to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 intervals. I'm not including unison right now. But there happens to be a note between a C and a D, right? So this note, a C sharp. So a C to a C sharp, which is actually a whole half step or a semitone, that interval is called a minor second. So C sharp happens to be to the left of D. So one fret to the left of a major second. So one note lower than a major second is a minor second. So C to a C sharp is called a minor second interval. Similarly, D and E have a note between them. So a C to a D sharp is called a minor third. Yeah? So one note to the left of major third is a minor third. E and F's do not really have a note between them. F and G have a note between them. So this is one note to the left of a perfect fifth. So this one is called a tritone. Tritone. A tritone, tri, and a tone. So tri means 3 and tone is a whole step. So tritone means 3 whole steps. So a C to an F sharp, basically C to a D is one whole step, D to an E is another whole step, and E to an F sharp is a third whole step, is another whole step, right? So that's 3 whole steps. So that interval is called a tritone. Similarly, a G to an A, between a 5 and a 6, this is called a minor sixth. A and B, from a C to A sharp or B flat is called a minor seventh, and B and C, they don't really have any note between them. Okay, so these are all the intervals that you should be knowing. So, so if I were to look at the, if I were to look at all the notes, so these are all the 12 notes. A C to a C sharp is called a minor second. A C to a D is a major second. C to D sharp is a minor third. C to an E is a major third. C to an F is called a perfect fourth. C to an F sharp is a tritone. C to a G is a perfect fifth. C to a G sharp is a minor sixth. C to an A is a major sixth. C to an A sharp is a minor seventh. C to B is a major seventh, and C to the next C is called an octave. Okay, so these are the simpler intervals. Okay, now understand, just like notes wherein I talked about enharmonic equivalence, we have enharmonic equivalence in intervals as well. So there are certain intervals which actually have more than one name, more than two names actually. So just to give an instance, there are two that I would like to talk about here. I'm sure you must have heard of these terms. One is a diminished and the other is augmented. Okay, so if you were to, if you hear the word diminished means to shrink, to shorten, and augmented means to stretch or to increase, right? So this is the perfect fifth interval. A C to a G is a perfect fifth. Now if you were to lower the perfect fifth by one note, now C to a G is a perfect fifth. If I were to lower G by one note, or if I were to flatten a G, or if I were to flatten the fifth, which is a flat 5, then it's called a diminished fifth, because essentially I'm taking the perfect fifth and I'm lowering it by one note. So if you lower a perfect fifth, it's called a diminished fifth. Now the question in your mind must be, this note F sharp or G flat is actually called a tritone. Yes, it is called a tritone, but it can also have a different name because its enharmonic equivalent happens to be a diminished fifth. So you take a perfect fifth and you lower it by one note, it's called a diminished fifth. Okay. Now there's a reason for that as well, but again, I'll probably make a lesson some other time. Because the intent of this lesson is not really to understand intervals as much as it is to understand chord construction, so we'll stick to that. Similarly, a minor sixth interval, which actually happens to be between a perfect fifth and a major sixth. A minor sixth, in one way to look at it is you're taking a major sixth and you're lowering it by one note. But minor sixth can also be seen as you're taking a perfect fifth and you're raising it by one note, because minor sixth happens to be between a perfect fifth and a major sixth, right? So if you were to raise a perfect fifth by one note, then it is actually called an augmented fifth. So essentially you're taking the fifth and you're raising it by one note, or you're augmenting it. Okay? So a tritone, which is one step to the left of a perfect fifth, can also be called a diminished fifth. Similarly, a minor sixth, which is one fret to the right or one note more than a perfect fifth, can also be called an augmented fifth. Now, a lot of intervals, but there are a few which I really want you to understand for this particular class. Now, which are those intervals? The first interval that you need to know is a major third. A major third, a C to an E, is nothing but two whole steps. Yeah? Similarly, a minor third is one whole step and one half step. So a C to a D sharp or a C to a E flat is called a minor third, which is one whole step and one half step. Right? So these are two intervals that you need to know. The third interval that you need to understand is a perfect fifth. Perfect fifth is, let's say, from a C to a G. So that's one whole step, two whole step, three whole step, and one half step. So perfect fifth is three whole steps plus one half step. Yeah? Then you need to understand a major seventh. A major seventh is from a C to a B. A C to a B is what? One whole step. 2 whole steps, 3 whole steps, 4 whole steps, 5 whole steps, and 1 half step. So 5 whole steps plus 1 half step is a major 7th. Similarly, a minor 7th is 5 whole steps. And then of course, your diminished fifth. Diminished fifth is 1 half step lesser than a perfect fifth, so that's 3 whole steps. And similarly, your augmented fifth is 1 half step more than your perfect fifth, so that's 4 whole steps. So these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 intervals that I want you to understand for this particular lesson, which is essentially understanding chords and chord construction. Okay, so these 7 intervals is what we need to know. In case you want more information, again, if you understand Hindi, then you can actually purchase my course, which is called Practical Music Theory, and it's the link for that is going to be in the description box. So I have explained everything about intervals and notes, and in a lot of detail, and a lot of those questions, important questions, have been answered in that particular course. Or what you can also do is, in case you want a little more information on intervals, I have a website called aditsguitarlessons.com, and I have written a few blogs on these topics, right? So you can actually check those out. Okay, so that's the basic information which you need to know in order to understand the whole concept of chords and chords construction. So we'll come to that main topic now. Okay, I'll just let this be because I want this information. We need this information for the next chords, next few chords. Okay, so now we come to chords. Now again, there are different kinds of chords, but what we'll do is, since this happens to be a series, we'll start off with some really basic ones, and then we'll get on to more fancy chords. So the simplest chords that you need to know about happen to be the triads. Now your question must be, triads? I haven't really played any C triad or an F triad. Triad is not exactly the name of a chord. Triad is actually the name of a group of chords. So there are basically 4 chords which are triads. Yeah, and these 4 chords happen to be a major chord, a minor, diminished, and augmented. So these 4 chords happen to be called triads. Now why are they called triads? 2 reasons. In order for a chord to be called or classified as a triad, there are 2 important factors. 2 important criteria that they need to satisfy. First is that there should be only 3 notes. So triad is in 3. So these chords need to have only 3 notes in them. And the second criterion is the fact that these chords need to be stacked in thirds. Now this is something which I'll explain in some time. But these are 2 important criteria that any chord needs to satisfy to be called a triad. Now there happen to be certain chords like suspended chords, sus2, sus4 chords. Similarly, inversions of certain chords. Now these chords have 3 notes, but they don't really satisfy the second condition, which is that their notes have to be stacked in thirds. Again, I'll talk about that in detail in some time. So basically there are only 4 chords which satisfy both these criteria, and therefore they're classified as triads. Okay, alright, so we'll start off with the major chords. Now a major chord, like I told you, there are 3 notes in these triads, three notes. Now any chord, just understand that any chord name will actually give you a little bit of information. So let's say you have a major chord, let's say you're playing a C major. A C major essentially means that there is a C and there is a major. Yeah? So the information that you're getting from the name is that there is a root and there is a quality. So in the case of a C major, a C happens to be the root and the quality is major. Similarly, if you remember, I started off this lesson with a chord, maybe it was a G major 7, sharp 5, sharp 9. So in this particular case, a G happens to be the root and the quality is major 7, sharp 5, sharp 9. Right? So any chord will have a root and it will have a quality. Now, since we're talking major, any major chord, let's say a C major, so there are 3 notes, 1, 2, and 3. First note will always be the root. So if let's say we're talking about a C major, the first note will always be a C, which is the root and a C in this particular case. Now there are 2 notes that we need to identify. in a way, the name of the chord will actually give you all the information that you need to know. Okay, so now we don't really know these two notes. Now just understand one thing. In any chord, one note will of course be the root. Another note will always be the perfect fifth. Now, perfect fifth and the root are extremely consonant. They actually get along really well. So they're like really good pals. They're really good buddies. Yeah. So in any chord, you will always have a root and a perfect fifth, unless explicitly mentioned. There are certain chords in which they will tell you. So for example, like you remember I told you a major 7, sharp 5, sharp 9. So in this particular case, you're not playing a perfect fifth, you're playing a sharp 5. So this particular chord explicitly tells you that there is no perfect fifth, but it has a sharp fifth. If any kind of information is there with respect to the 5, then this essentially means that something has been done to the fifth. If there is no mention of a fifth in it, just assume that there's going to be a perfect fifth. Okay, so this is an assumption for all of the chords. Okay, so we know that one note happens to be the root, which in the case of a C major is a C. The third note will be the perfect fifth. Now you might say, why not this particular note? And I'll come to that. But I'm just telling you that the one note is a root, okay, which happens to be a C in this case, and the one note happens to be a perfect fifth, which happens to be a G in the case of a C. So let me just write down all the notes for you so that it's a little easier for you to understand. So C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and a C. So one note is the root, which is a C. Second note is a perfect fifth, which is a G. Now we know two notes. Right from the name, we already know two notes, and since it's a triad, so there's only one note that we need to identify. Now this note can be any one of these three. Any one of these, or probably it could be one of these as well. Yeah. Now here you need to understand a principle, which is, you remember I told you that in triads there are two criteria. So first criterion is that there need to be three notes, and the second criterion is that they need to be stacked in thirds. What this point essentially means is that between any of these notes, the maximum interval that we can have is a major third. The minimum interval that we need to have is a minor third. So basically, the interval has to be a third between any two consecutive notes. Again, let me just simplify it for you. So we know that one note is a C. We know that one note is a G. Now we don't really know the third note. Now using this principle, which is that the maximum interval can be a major third, minimum can be a minor third, let's assume that the second note happens to be, let's say, a D. Again, an assumption. So basically it's a C, a D, and a G. Now between a C and a D, what is the interval? So that's one whole step, which is a major second. So right off the bat, this condition is not met. The condition was that minimum gap needs to be a minor third, which is a whole step and a half step, and maximum gap needs to be two whole steps. So essentially what we can do is we can just look at this and we can just say, okay, fine, this is one whole step and this is one half step. So either the note has to be a D sharp, or it can be a major third, which is one whole step plus another whole step, which is an E. So the note in the middle can only be a D sharp, or it can be an E. It cannot be a C sharp, it cannot be a D, it cannot be an F, it cannot be an F sharp, right? Because we need to satisfy this condition, the second condition of triads, which is minimum minor third interval, maximum major third interval. So one of these two. C to a D sharp is a minor third, and C to an E is a major third. Now just think, if it's a major chord, is the interval going to be a minor third, or is it going to be a major third? The answer is it's a major third. And that is the reason why a major chord is called a major. That's because the second note happens to be a major third interval. Now you'll have some questions, and I'll come to those questions in some time. So essentially a C major has a C, a G, and an E, because a C to an E happens to be a major third interval. Okay, now the question that you're probably thinking of is that a C major has a major third interval and a perfect fifth interval, so why don't we call it a C major third chord? Or why don't we call it a C major third perfect fifth chord? Now the reason is that if you were to, so music theory is, see, essentially music started off, I don't know, lot of years back, yeah? And at that point in time, all of the chords are very simple chords. So triads were with the basic chords which we started off when music originated. And all of those chords were stacked in threes. So the assumption was always that these chords will have threes in them. So it has to be a minor third or a major third. That is the assumption. So we don't really need to say a major third. If we say a major, just a major, it will have to be a major third interval. And of course I told you that perfect fifth, because a root and a perfect fifth are extremely consonant since they actually get along really well. So we will never include a perfect fifth in the name. So that's the only reason, right? So if a chord says major, it essentially means that the first note is a root and the second note will be a major third interval away from the root. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So that's your major chord. Now what we can do is, if I were to just write down like a little formula for you. So a major chord has a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth. Now this can also be represented with a root, a 3, and a 5, just to keep things simple, because a 3 means a major third, 5 means perfect fifth. Okay, I'll come to the other notation for minors and all. But here the intervals are from the root. So a major third from the root and a perfect fifth from the root. However, you can also look at the intervals between these between each of these notes. So from the first to the second note, second note, it's a major third interval, right? From a C to an E is a major third interval. Now, instead of looking at from a C to a G, we can also say from an E to a G. From an E to a G, it's one whole step and one half step, which actually happens to be a minor third. So there are two ways in which we can actually represent a major chord. First is, it's got a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth from the root. So taking the root as a reference. And you can also say that a major chord actually has a major third and a minor third from that second note. So two ways to actually represent the same chord. But here you see that it's stacked in thirds. So there's a major third and then there's a minor third stacked. Okay, so that's the second criterion of classifying a chord as triads. Okay, so the next one is a minor. So minor chord, again, it's a triad, so there has to be a root and there has to be a perfect fifth. Now we don't really know the second note. No points for guessing. This needs to be a minor third interval. So minor third is a small m and a 3. So this can also be represented by a root, a flat 3, and a 5, because a minor third is nothing but one fret to the left of the major third. Yeah, so that's a flattened 3. Root, flat 3, and 5. So in this particular case, if you were to look at it, C to a D sharp, one whole step and one half step, one whole step and one half step. It's actually not a D sharp, it's called an E flat. So it's not a D sharp, it's an E flat. Okay, but you can call it a D sharp if you want. So C to an E flat to a G. So this is a minor third interval. This is a perfect fifth interval. And this E flat or D sharp to a G happens to be 2 whole steps or a major third interval. So essentially a minor chord is a root followed by a minor third and a perfect fifth, or a root and a flat third and a fifth, or you can also say that it's got a minor third interval and a major third interval. So minor third, and then there's a major third between the second and the third note. Okay, so these are our basic chords, major and minors. Now we'll come to the interesting stuff, which is a diminished chord. Okay, now diminished, like I told you, all the chords will have a perfect fifth unless it's explicitly mentioned that the fifth has some changes done to it. Now here, when it says diminished, since it doesn't really say diminished seventh or some other diminished number, since it only says diminished, the assumption is that it has to be a diminished 5 chord. So diminished 5 is a diminished fifth interval, which is 3 whole steps. So let's say we need to play a C diminished, C diminished chord. First note is of course a root. It's a triad, so there are 3 notes. And we know that the last note is not exactly a perfect fifth, but it's a diminished fifth. A diminished fifth is nothing but 3 whole steps. So 3 whole steps means C to a D is 1 whole step, D to an E is 1 whole step, and E to an F sharp is the 3rd whole step. So this 3rd note, which is a diminished fifth, is an F sharp, or in this particular case it's actually called a G flat, because we are taking a G and we are flattening it. We're lowering the G, which is the perfect fifth. Or you can just to make things simple, you can call it an F sharp, but it's not an F sharp, it's a G flat. So once again, so the first note is a C, the last note is a G flat or an F sharp. Okay. Now we need to find out the second note. There's no information about the second note since it doesn't really say major third or minor third, it just says diminished. Now which note can it be? Again, you remember the second criterion, which was that the notes need to be stacked in thirds. So the minimum interval can be a minor third and the maximum can be a major third. So the second note can either be a D sharp or it can be an E, right? Because D sharp is the minimum distance and E is the maximum distance. So it can be one of these two. So let's assume that it's an E. Let's assume that the second note is an E. So a C to an E is a major third, so that condition is getting met. But from an E to an F sharp, because here the 3rd note is an F sharp, right? So an E to an F sharp is a whole step, 1 whole step, so which is a major second interval. So this condition is not getting met. Second condition, which is that it has to be at least a minor third interval. It has to be stacked in thirds, right? So this condition is not getting met. So it cannot be an E. Now let's take a D sharp. A C to a D sharp is 1 minor third interval. Minor third interval. So this condition is getting met. And from a D sharp to an F sharp, D sharp to F is whole step, F to F sharp is half step. So whole step and half step, which is another minor third. A minor third followed by a minor third. Now in this particular case, both the conditions are getting met. I hope that made sense. So essentially a diminished chord, the information that we're getting from the chord name is that there's a root and there's a diminished fifth. There's no information about the second note, but if we were to use the criterion, the important criterion, which is that the minimum gap needs to be a minor third and the maximum gap needs to be a major third, then we will know that the note in the middle has to be a minor third. So basically it's a root, a flat 3 and a flat 5. A diminished 5 is like 5 and you flatten it by 1 note. So root, flat 3 and flat 5. Or in terms of intervals, it can be called a minor third with another minor third stacked on it. Okay, so that's a diminished chord. I hope that made sense. If it didn't make sense, then we'll actually do the same exercise for your augmented chords, and then I'm very sure that you'll understand. So let's take the augmented chord now. Okay, now augmented, so when we hear the word augmented, since it doesn't say augmented some other number, the assumption is that it's going to be an augmented fifth. So which essentially means we take the fifth and we raise it by 1 note. So from C, the fifth happens to be a G. Now if we raise a G by 1 note, it's a G sharp. So we know the first note is a root, and the fifth note is an augmented fifth, which happens to be a G sharp in this particular case. Now this is the information that we know from the chord name, but we don't really know which is the second note. Now we need to find that out. Now it can be either a D sharp or it can be an E flat. I hope you've understood why it can be only a D sharp or an E flat, because it has to be a minimum minor third gap or a maximum major third gap. So it can be only these 2 notes. Now let's assume that it's a D sharp. So if it's a D sharp, a C to a D sharp is a minor third interval, which is cool. But from a D sharp to a G sharp, that's 1 whole step, 2 whole steps, and there's two whole steps and a half. So that second condition is not getting met because it's more than a major third interval. So let's take an E. A C to an E is a major third interval. That condition is getting met. Maximum is a major third. And from an E to a G sharp is E to an F sharp is 1 whole step. F sharp to G sharp is a second whole step. So that's also a major third interval. So both the conditions are getting met here, which is maximum a major third interval between these 2 notes. So essentially an augmented chord is a root, augmented fifth, and a major third interval. Or it can also be represented by a root, 3 and a sharp 5. Or in this particular case, we can say an augmented chord is a major third interval with another major third interval stacked on top. Okay, so these are our triads, which are the major, minor, diminished, and augmented. Now just understand something. Like I told you earlier, there happen to be other chords as well which have 3 notes, like suspended, sus2 chords, sus4 chords, but these aren't really called triads because they don't really meet the second criterion, which is that the chords need to have notes stacked in thirds, right? So we'll talk about those suspended chords and the inversions and the 7s in the next lesson. But I really hope you've understood this bit. Actually, we haven't really talked about major 7, minor 7th here, but we'll talk about that in another video because this video is like almost 50 minutes long. Not 50 actually, 40 minutes long. So yeah, I'll just keep the other things for some other video. Alright, so I really hope you enjoyed this. It's not very difficult. In case you haven't really understood this, my suggestion to you would be to just watch the video again, maybe slow it down a little bit if you think that I was speaking too fast. But it's a fairly easy concept. See the video a couple of times and I'm very sure you'll understand this. And once you're able to internalize all of this information along with the information that I'll give you in the other lessons, believe me, constructing your own chords is not going to be very difficult. So the one habit that you really need to develop is to not be dependent on the internet. So if you hear a chord, let's say a major, let's say you hear a diminished chord, for example. Now don't Google C diminished and just see the shape and then try to play that. Don't do that. Think now. A C diminished needs to have these notes. Now let me just try plotting the notes on the fretboard. Let me just see what kind of a chord I can play. Use this lesson. I actually made another video a couple of days back, which was actually in a different channel of mine, but I'll just put the link. And in that video, I've actually explained how to construct chords once you know the formula. So use this video and that video and you'll be able to play all of the chords on your own, right? So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed that lesson, this lesson. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and let me know in case there is some other content that you would like me to talk about in my future videos. This is Addy and I'll be seeing you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.